For most of my life, I believed that silence was the highest form of grace. My mother taught me that a woman's dignity is not in what she says, but in what she endures. Perhaps that is why I let Cynthia turn my home into a palace where I was nothing more than a servant. Every morning, she filled the house with noise, the clatter of heels, the hum of her laughter, the rustle of expensive silk. It was the sound of someone who knew the world revolved around her. And my son Louis, the boy I had raised with love and discipline, had become her moon, circling her glow, blind to the shadows she cast. When he brought her home for the first time 10 years ago, she had looked at me with that perfect smile, polite, soft, and sharp enough to draw blood. I remember thinking, this woman will bring light into my son's life. How wrong I was. The first year after their marriage, I tried to make peace with her. I offered to teach her how to cook Louis's favorite dishes, the ones he grew up with, my lamb stew, the honey cakes we made on holidays. She declined every offer with a sweet apology and an air of superiority that made my chest tighten. "That's sweet, Dolores, but I prefer modern recipes," she would say. Then she'd call the caterer. Slowly, the kitchen that had been my kingdom became foreign to me. The smell of homemade bread was replaced by imported cheese and polished steel. Even the walls seemed to forget the sound of my voice. I would stand at the window, looking out at the garden my husband had planted decades ago, and feel like a guest in a museum of my own memories. But it wasn't just the home she took. It was my place within it. Louis began spending less time talking to me. His calls became shorter, his tone colder. Whenever I tried to speak about household matters, Cynthia would interrupt, smiling. "Don't worry, Mother, we've got it handled." We. Not he. Not me. We. As if she and Louis were one entity, and I was the relic left behind. She began rearranging the house, moving the furniture, taking down family portraits, replacing my old curtains with sterile, white ones that made the place look like a hotel. My wedding photo, the one of me and Henry on our first day as husband and wife, vanished from the mantel. I found it later in the attic, its frame cracked, the glass gone. I didn't confront her. What good would that have done? Louis would have told me I was overreacting, that Cynthia didn't mean any harm. So I stayed quiet. I let her talk down to me, command me, and treat me as if I were a burden. "Dolores, could you iron my dress for tonight? Dolores, make me a coffee, please. Strong like your patience." She'd laugh after that line, and I'd smile politely, though I felt like screaming. I began to disappear in my own home. I ate my meals alone in the kitchen, while they dined in the formal room with guests. I listened to them toast their perfect lives while I washed their dishes. Every night, I prayed for strength, and every morning, I put on the same quiet smile, pretending not to hear the whispers of pity from our visitors who wondered why I still lived there. But then came the moment that changed everything, the day I found my wedding album in the trash. It was a Sunday morning. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, and I went to fetch the newspaper from the porch. As I passed by the garbage bin, a glint of light caught my eye. There it was, the album, the one Henry and I had made together in our youth, the one with pressed flowers between the pages. I froze. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, the edges torn, photos crumpled and smudged with coffee stains. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That album was not just paper and pictures. It was my life, my love, my history. I sank to my knees on the cold floor, holding it to my chest, and something inside me shattered. The tears came, but not from sadness, from fury. Quiet, burning fury. I realized then that Cynthia hadn't just taken over my home. She was trying to erase me, and I wouldn't let her succeed. That night, I went to my room and unlocked the small wooden chest I kept under the bed. Inside was the pink diamond ring, the one Henry had given me on our 20th anniversary. He had called it our legacy, the heart of our family, he said. I had kept it hidden for years, not because of its value, but because it reminded me of love that was pure, loyal, and kind, things that had no place in Cynthia's world. I held it in my palm, the light from the lamp dancing across its surface, and for the first time in years I smiled. Not the soft, defeated smile I wore for the world, but a sharp, determined one. The kind of smile that belongs to a woman who has made up her mind. The pink diamond would not rest quietly in its box anymore. It would serve one final purpose, to remind everyone, especially Cynthia, that even the quietest women can roar when pushed too far. The next few days passed in silence, the kind of silence that feels like a sharp knife hidden under velvet. I moved through the house like always, quiet, obedient, invisible, but my mind was alive with thought. I began to notice the smallest details. Cynthia's routines, her vanity, the way she always sought admiration like air. She never went anywhere without her jewelry, her makeup perfectly done, her perfume lingering even after she left her room. I realized that her pride was her weakness. She measured her worth by the eyes that watched her, by the admiration she received, by the image she projected. If that image ever cracked, even slightly, she would crumble. That was where I would strike. It began simply. I started to act more fragile, more helpless, more forgetful than I really was. "Oh, Cynthia dear," I'd say softly. I seemed to have misplaced the silver tray again. "Would you mind checking the dining room? Or Louis, I can't find the house keys. I think I left them in the pantry." My son would sigh, pat my shoulder, and tell Cynthia, "She's getting old, be patient." Every time he said that, I smiled to myself. The more they underestimated me, the easier my task became. I spent hours alone in my room, writing notes, making lists, organizing the old documents my husband had left behind. I learned the structure of our estate, the legal details of the property, and the insurance records that still listed my name as the primary owner of several valuable items, including the pink diamond ring. I realized something then. Cynthia had no idea how much of this house still belonged to me. Then one afternoon, while Cynthia was preparing for a dinner party, I entered her dressing room quietly. It smelled like roses and greed. On her vanity lay dozens of gold necklaces, earrings, and bracelets, all gifts from Louis. I looked at them for a long time. Beautiful things, yes, but they had no soul, only shine. I saw a small jewelry box, opened it, and smiled. My pink diamond would look perfect there. The thought made me laugh quietly to myself. I wasn't planning to steal or hide her jewelry. No, my plan was far more elegant. I wanted her to take mine. That evening, I invited her for tea, something I hadn't done in years. She was surprised, but her curiosity won. "Of course, Dolores," she said with that perfect smile. "How lovely." We sat in the garden, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine. I poured her tea, my hand steady, my voice calm. "You know," I began softly, "my late husband always said you had excellent taste. He would have adored your collection. I still have a few old pieces, nothing compared to your treasures, of course." Her eyes lit up immediately. "Oh, what kind of pieces?" I chuckled gently. "Just old trinkets, things that belong to another time. I keep them in the chest in my room. Maybe one day, when I'm gone, you can have them. They'd look far better on you." I could almost see the thought forming behind her perfect smile. The seed was planted. 2 nights later, the bait was taken. I heard her heels clicking down the hallway while the house slept. I stayed still in my bed, the faint glow from the nightlight catching her silhouette as she entered my room. She moved like a thief who believed she was invisible. She opened the chest and lifted the pink diamond ring, her eyes wide with greed. I could almost feel her heart racing. She thought she was clever, thought she was taking something worthless that I would never notice missing. I smiled in the darkness, waiting until I heard her bedroom door close. The moment had come. At dawn, I called my lawyer, Frank Miller. He had been my husband's friend for decades, a man of quiet integrity and sharp mind. "Frank," I said calmly, "I need you to file a report. Inventory item number 847, the pink diamond ring. It has been stolen." There was a pause. "Dolores," he said slowly, "are you sure?" I smiled. "Yes, Frank. Quite sure." Within an hour, the report was filed. I went about my morning as usual, humming softly while making coffee, as if nothing had happened. By evening, Cynthia was radiant. She was hosting another of her grand parties, filled with people who adored her charm and envied her grace. From my place on the stairs, I watched her move among the guests, laughing, showing off the very ring on her hand. My ring. The pink diamond sparkled under the chandelier like a secret winking at me. I almost pitied her, almost. She had no idea that the police had already been informed that by the end of the night, her world would collapse. I stood quietly, watching as she bragged about how she'd borrowed an old ring from dear Dolores, dismissing it as a silly little antique. Her friends laughed, and she basked in the attention. When the sirens arrived, the laughter died. The police entered through the front door, their voices low but firm. The guests whispered, confusion spreading like wildfire. I stood up, my cane in hand, and descended the staircase slowly. The lead officer approached. "Mrs. Dolores Whitman?" he asked. "Yes," I replied softly. "We received a report of a missing diamond ring, valued at $3 million. Gasps echoed through the room. Cynthia turned pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. What? "That ring. It's just a trinket," she stammered. I met her eyes for the first time in years and smiled gently. "No, my dear. It's a registered piece of our family's private collection. And you were wearing it." The next moments were chaos. The guests whispered, Louis tried to protest, and Cynthia began to cry, insisting she didn't steal it. But the police had no patience for theatrics. They took her aside, asked questions, and within minutes, the glamour of her perfect life shattered. I stood there, calm and still, the quiet storm finally released. For 10 years, she had treated me as invisible. That night, everyone saw me, and her for what she truly was. The house that had once echoed with Cynthia's laughter now fell into a silence so heavy it could crush the soul. The guests had long gone, leaving behind empty glasses, wilted flowers, and whispers that would travel far beyond our walls. The police had taken Cynthia for questioning, and Louis, pale and trembling, stood in the middle of the living room as though the ground beneath him had vanished. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. "Mother, how could this happen?" he asked, his voice breaking. I wanted to tell him that this was not sudden, that it was the result of years of blindness and neglect, but I only said, "Sometimes, Louis, the truth takes its time to arrive." He sank into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. The mighty businessman, the devoted husband, reduced to a frightened boy once more. I watched him silently. My heart, despite everything, ached for him. He was my son, my flesh and blood, yet I could not protect him from the truth any longer. 4 years, I had allowed him to believe the illusion Cynthia had built, a world of glittering lies wrapped in expensive gowns. Now the curtain had been torn down, and what lay behind was ugly and real. The media wasted no time. By morning, the story was everywhere. Socialite arrested for theft of $3 million diamond ring. Reporters gathered outside our gates, their voices like vultures circling fresh prey. I closed the curtains and stayed upstairs, sipping tea while the chaos unfolded below. For once, I didn't feel fear or guilt, only calm satisfaction. It wasn't revenge that warmed me, it was justice. Louis spent the next few days running from one office to another, trying to fix the damage, speaking to lawyers, begging for explanations. But Cynthia's arrogance had left traces everywhere. She had pawned smaller jewelry, taken out loans under false names, and used his money to fund her extravagant lifestyle. The police investigation uncovered everything, piece by piece, until her image as the perfect wife disintegrated entirely. I watched it all unfold with quiet resolve. Sometimes I thought about speaking to Louis, comforting him, telling him that life had a way of cleansing itself. But then I remembered how many times I had tried to speak before, how many times he had silenced me with a tired, "Not now, mother." So, I stayed silent, letting him face the weight of his own choices. On the 3rd night after her arrest, he came to my room. He looked older, not in years, but in spirit. "Mother," he said, his voice hollow, "you knew, didn't you? You knew she was trouble." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "Yes, I did. But you wouldn't have listened." He nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought she just needed time to adjust." I smiled sadly. "No, Louis. You were protecting an illusion. We all do that. Sometimes." He sat beside me, the same way he had when he was a child afraid of thunderstorms. For the first time in a decade, he let me hold his hand. There were no words that could heal the years between us, but that touch, it was enough. Cynthia was released on bail 2 days later, but her world had already collapsed. Her friends avoided her, the media hounded her, and her reputation was shattered. She returned home late at night, her face pale and drawn. I was in the living room, knitting quietly by the fire. When she walked in, our eyes met. Two women who had spent 10 years under the same roof, bound by nothing but resentment. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, trembling, her mask of perfection gone. "You planned this," she whispered finally. "You wanted to destroy me." I set down my knitting and looked at her. "No, Cynthia. You destroyed yourself. I simply stopped protecting you from the truth." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were of humiliation. She turned away, her shoulders shaking, and for a brief moment I felt pity. But pity was a luxury she had never offered me. Over the next few weeks, she and Louis lived like strangers. He spoke little, and she avoided me entirely. The house was quiet, too quiet. No music, no laughter, only the sound of footsteps on marble and the ticking of clocks. I spent my mornings in the garden again, tending to the roses that Henry had planted. They had nearly died under Cynthia's careless watch, but with care, they began to bloom once more. Watching them, I realized how much life mirrors nature, how beauty can only survive where it is nurtured, not controlled. I also realized something else. I had not only reclaimed my home, I had reclaimed myself. One afternoon, Louis approached me in the garden. "Mother," he said softly, "I've decided to sell the house." I looked up from the roses, surprised. "Sell it? Why?" He sighed. "There are too many memories here. Too much pain." I studied his face and saw the boy he once was, lost and searching. "Then perhaps it's time to build something new," I said. He nodded. "I want you to live with me, in the new place. Somewhere peaceful." For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I smiled. "I'll think about it." When he walked away, I looked back at the house, the grand, cold mansion that had been both my prison and my weapon. I realized that I was finally free. Cynthia's downfall had not been about vengeance alone. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, my place in the world. She had taken my silence for weakness, but she had never understood that silence can be a blade sharper than any sword. That night, as I watched the firelight dance across the pink diamond ring resting in its box, once more I whispered, "Thank you, Henry. You were right. It did protect me." And for the first time in years, I slept without bitterness in my heart. Months passed, and the scandal slowly faded from the newspapers, replaced by fresher stories of greed and betrayal. But within our walls, the echoes of what had happened lingered like ghosts. Louis and Cynthia existed like two strangers inhabiting the same house, their marriage a hollow shell. She rarely left her room, and when she did, her face was hidden behind large sunglasses, her hair tied in a tight knot, her once flawless posture slightly bent. It was astonishing how swiftly pride could rot into shame. There had been a time when she commanded the attention of every room she entered, when her laughter filled the air like perfume. Now, she moved through the house like a shadow, silent, careful, almost invisible. In another life, perhaps I would have pitied her. But in this one, I had learned that pity is a gift too valuable to waste on those who never earned it. Louis, on the other hand, had begun to change. Slowly, quietly, as though waking from a long, heavy sleep. He spoke to me more often now, not with the hurried politeness of obligation, but with the gentleness of genuine care. Some evenings, we sat together in the garden, drinking tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. He asked questions about my youth, about his father, about the life that existed before Cynthia's reign of glitter and noise. Sometimes, he apologized without using words, a look, a sigh, a hand placed softly on mine. It wasn't necessary to say more. We both knew that love had found its way back through the cracks left by heartbreak. The house, however, still carried Cynthia's scent, a mix of roses and something bitter underneath. Every room she had once claimed still bore her touch. Every mirror seemed to hold her reflection. It wasn't enough for me to forgive. I needed to reclaim the air itself. So I began to change things. I brought back my husband's old paintings, hung the family portraits once more, replaced the sterile white curtains with soft gold ones that welcomed the morning light. The kitchen, which had become cold and lifeless, I revived with the smell of baked bread and cinnamon. Slowly, the house began to breathe again. It was no longer a museum of resentment. It was alive. One morning, I went into town to visit the lawyer, Frank Miller, for the last time regarding the insurance paperwork. He greeted me with a warm smile, his eyes twinkling with admiration. "Dolores, you're something else," he said, chuckling softly as he handed me the finalized documents. "I don't think I've ever seen justice served quite so elegantly." I smiled back. It wasn't about revenge, Frank. It was about remembering who I am. He nodded, understanding more than words could say. Before I left, he added, "You know, if you ever decide to tell your story, people might actually learn something from it." I laughed. Perhaps one day. That afternoon, when I returned home, I found Cynthia sitting in the living room, staring out the window. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't look up when I entered. For a moment, I considered walking away, but something inside me stopped me. "You know," I said quietly, "the world doesn't end because people stop admiring you. Sometimes, it only begins when they do." She turned her face toward me, her expression blank. "You won, Dolores," she whispered bitterly. "Is that what you wanted?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Cynthia. I wanted peace. You could have had it too." There was no anger in my voice, only truth. She didn't reply. I left her there, bathed in the pale light of a setting sun, looking like a queen stripped of her crown. A few weeks later, Louis announced that he was selling the house after all. He said he wanted a smaller place, something quieter, where he and I could start fresh. I agreed, though I knew in my heart that the memories here, both bitter and sweet, had made me stronger than I had ever been. The day the movers came, I walked through each room one last time. The study where Henry used to read, the hallway where Louis had taken his first steps, the kitchen where I had spent decades of my life. I touched the walls, said silent goodbyes, and when I reached the front door, I turned back one final time. Cynthia stood at the top of the stairs, watching me. Her face was unreadable. "Goodbye, Cynthia," I said softly. "Take care of yourself." She didn't answer, but her eyes followed me until I stepped outside. The new house was small, modest, and quiet, a cottage by the sea that smelled of salt and wildflowers. The first night there, I sat by the window listening to the waves crashing against the rocks, and for the first time in decades, I felt something close to joy. Not the loud, fleeting kind that Cynthia had chased her whole life, but the quiet, deep kind that lives inside peace. Louis visited often, sometimes staying for days, helping me with the garden, or reading on the porch while I cooked. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. We didn't need to. The wounds were still there, but they had begun to heal in silence. Occasionally, I would see Cynthia's name in the papers, not in scandals anymore, but in charity events and small public appearances. It seemed she was trying to rebuild herself, though I doubted she could ever wash away the stain of her own arrogance. Perhaps, I thought, that was punishment enough. I no longer wished her ill. Some lessons are only learned through loss, and she had lost everything, her reputation, her wealth, her pride. Maybe in her quiet moments, she would finally understand what I had known all along, that the measure of a woman is not in what she owns, but in how she endures. As for me, I found peace not in revenge, but in survival. I tended my roses, wrote in my journal, and watched the sea. Some days were lonely, yes, but even loneliness felt cleaner now, honest and free. There were no more games, no more masks, just the soft rhythm of life unfolding as it should. And whenever I opened the little wooden chest and saw the pink diamond ring glimmering in the light, I didn't see a symbol of revenge anymore. I saw the proof that I had survived everything meant to break me. Time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest memories. The sea became my companion in those quiet years that followed, whispering secrets in its endless rhythm. Each morning, I would wake to the sound of waves brushing the shore, and it felt as though the ocean itself was breathing for me, steady, forgiving, infinite. I had traded marble floors for creaking wooden steps, chandeliers for sunlight pouring through lace curtains, and for the first time, my home felt alive. Louis came every Sunday, his face calmer now, the old guilt slowly dissolving into something warmer, something that looked like peace. He would bring groceries, sometimes flowers, and we would share long afternoons talking about his father, about life, about how silence could be both prison and prayer. One evening he said, "Mother, you were right. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's waiting." I smiled at that. Waiting had been my greatest art. The townspeople soon came to know me, the quiet widow who tended roses and baked bread for the children who played near the shore. They didn't know my story, they only knew that I smiled easily and listened well. There was a kind of freedom in anonymity. In the city, I had been a ghost in my own mansion. Here, I was simply Dolores, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman I once was. The bitterness had faded from my face, replaced by calm lines of wisdom. The world had changed, and so had I. The past still lived within me, yes, but it no longer defined me. It was a lesson, not a wound. Letters still arrived from Frank Miller every few months, updates about the estate, documents for me to sign. He always wrote the same line at the end. You remind me that quiet justice is still justice. I liked that. Justice didn't always need to roar. Sometimes it whispered, slow and certain, through the choices we make. I often thought about Cynthia when I read those letters. Rumor had it she had moved abroad after the divorce, remarried a wealthy businessman, and kept herself out of the public eye. Perhaps she had finally learned humility, perhaps not. But I bore her no hatred anymore. Hatred ties you to the very thing you wish to escape. Letting go was harder, but far more liberating. One spring afternoon, Louis and I visited the city together for the first time in years. We passed by the old mansion, now owned by another family. The garden was trimmed, the windows gleamed, but it felt foreign, like a chapter from a book long finished. Louis stopped by the gate, staring for a while. It doesn't look as big as I remember, he said. Things rarely do, I replied. That's what happens when we stop being small. He smiled, understanding. We stood there in silence, two survivors of a storm that had nearly drowned us both. Before we left, I placed a single rose from my cottage garden through the bars of the gate, not out of nostalgia, but as a symbol of closure, of forgiveness, of endings that no longer hurt. When we returned to the seaside, the sun was setting in gold and crimson streaks across the water. Louis cooked dinner, badly, but with effort, and as we ate, I realized how much he had grown. Not into the man Cynthia had shaped, but into the man his father had hoped he'd become. Humble, thoughtful, kind. You know, he said suddenly, I used to think you were lonely here, but I see now that you're content. I laughed softly. Loneliness and contentment are old friends, my dear. The trick is knowing which one has come to visit. He chuckled, and for a moment, I saw the boy who used to run barefoot through the halls, the one who'd bring me seashells from the shore. It was in that laughter that I found the final piece of peace I'd been searching for. Years slipped by gently. My hair turned white, my steps slower, but my spirit lighter than it had ever been. I wrote letters, not to anyone in particular, but to myself, to Henry, to life. I wrote about forgiveness, about strength, about the quiet power that comes from surviving without losing your soul. Sometimes I imagined other women reading them long after I was gone, women who felt invisible, who had been silenced, dismissed, underestimated. I wanted them to know that stillness is not surrender, and kindness is not weakness. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers from behind gentle eyes and steady hands. I wanted them to know that even after betrayal, there is life, and sometimes even beauty. One morning, I walked along the beach, the tide cool against my feet. In my hand, I carried the pink diamond ring, wrapped in a silk cloth. I had decided it was time to let it go. It had served its purpose, as a symbol, a shield, a lesson. I stood at the edge of the water and opened my hand. The ring caught the sunlight one last time, flashing pink fire across the waves before slipping quietly into the sea. I watched until it disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the very force that had taught me renewal. Goodbye, I whispered, not to the ring, but to everything it represented, the pain, the pride, the years of silence. The ocean accepted my offering without judgment, only with the soft rhythm of waves pulling back to shore. When I returned home, I felt lighter, as though some invisible weight had lifted. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the moon rise. The sea shimmered under its glow, and I thought about Henry, about love that had endured beyond time. I thought about Louis, who had finally learned to see. And, yes, I thought about Cynthia, somewhere far away, perhaps looking at another horizon, maybe wondering if she could begin again. Life has a way of humbling all of us, sooner or later. And though she had brought years of sorrow into my life, she had also, in her own twisted way, given me back my strength. For that, I was strangely grateful. As the night deepened, I closed my eyes and listened to the waves. I was no longer the invisible mother-in-law, nor the silent victim. I was simply Dolores, a woman who had been broken, remade, and reborn in her own quiet revolution. I had learned that dignity is not given, it is reclaimed. That revenge can be an act of justice when tempered with wisdom. And that the most beautiful victories are the ones that leave no scars, only stories. Somewhere in the distance, the tide whispered again, carrying my past away with it. I smiled. My story was done, and it had ended exactly as it was meant to, not with anger, but with peace.